at 8 p.m. ET on April 7th. If Hormuz is still effectively shut, the deadline stops being a warning and becomes a verdict. In that instant, Washington has to decide whether to widen the war, fake a definition of reopened, or let the whole world watch a public ultimatum die on the clock. That is what the title is really asking. And by the time that hour arrives, this is already far beyond a shipping dispute. American commandos have already gone deep into Iran and climbed a 7,000-foot ridge to pull out a stranded weapons specialist from a downed F-15 jet. So when the deadline hits, nobody gets to pretend this crisis is still happening at a safe distance. That airman spent more than a day hiding in a mountain crevice behind enemy lines with a pistol, a communication device, and a tracking beacon. That is the reality sitting underneath the countdown. Before 8 p.m. decides anything for markets or diplomats, Americans are already inside the consequences of this war. The clock is arriving late to a crisis that is already bleeding. If you want the version of events that starts where official language breaks down, subscribe now. And when this is over, tell me in the comments what you think 8 p.m. really becomes the trigger, the bluff, or the moment everyone realizes Hormuz was never going to be forced open on command. Here's the first hard truth. Hormuz has been effectively shut down across a route that carries about 20% of the world's oil, which means this deadline is not expiring over a symbolic dispute. It is expiring over whether the most important energy choke point on Earth remains under a live Iranian chokehold when Washington's clock runs out. So what happens at 8 p.m. if Hormuz is still shut? First, the White House has to decide whether this counts as defiance. Second, traders and governments have to decide whether the threat was ever meant to be enforced. Third, Iran gets to demonstrate that it can keep the artery of global energy half strangled without needing a perfect blockade. That is why the title is so dangerous. It sounds like a time question, but it is really a power question. Who controls reality at that hour? The country that set the deadline, or the country that has learned how to weaponize just enough fear to make normal shipping collapse? Traffic through the strait is down about 95% from before the conflict, even though a small number of ships have still crossed. That number destroys the lazy argument that a few surviving transits mean the waterway is basically open. It is not open in any commercial sense that matters. And that is exactly where both governments hide. One side points to the tiny number of vessels that still move and says the lane is not truly closed. The other points to the collapse in normal traffic and says reopening is non-negotiable. But the market already chose which version is real, and the market chose fear. A choke point does not need a steel gate across it to break the world. It only needs captains, insurers, refiners, and governments to start acting like the route is no longer safe. Once that happens, legal arguments become background noise. Some of the ships that have crossed recently were sailing unusually close to the Omani coast rather than moving through a restored commercial corridor. That detail matters because it shows passage is no longer governed by confidence. It is governed by survival, caution, and the understanding that one wrong move in that lane can still turn into a strategic event. That is not reopening. That is controlled breathing through a crushed throat. And if ships are still moving like that when the deadline expires, Washington has a serious problem. It can either tell the world that this fragile, abnormal, coast-hugging movement counts as success, or admit that Iran still owns the terms of passage. Iran's real innovation in this crisis is not military genius. It is strategic minimalism. It has discovered that it does not need to shut everything, sink everything, or declare everything. It only has to keep the route dangerous enough, selective enough, and expensive enough that normality never returns. That is why 8 p.m. matters more than another exchange of threats. If the strait is still effectively shut at that moment, the deadline becomes a referendum on whether selective strangulation is enough to beat American coercion. And if the answer is yes, every government watching learns from it. The scale of what hangs on that hour is brutal. About 20 million barrels per day move through Hormuz, roughly 25% of the world's seaborne oil trade, and about 80% of that flow is headed to Asia. So if the deadline expires without real reopening, the first shock is not local and it is not abstract. It hits the most exposed part of the global economy almost immediately. That turns 8 p.m. Eastern Time into something much bigger than an American political timestamp. It becomes an Asia-facing energy hour, a market psychology hour, and an alliance credibility hour all at once. When that many layers stack on top of 1 minute, failure does not stay contained. This is where the audience click intent lives. People do not click this title just to hear that oil matters and Hormuz is important. They click because they want to know whether 8 p.m. is the moment markets panic, the moment Washington blinks, or the moment the road to a wider war opens up in full view. The honest answer is that all three possibilities get activated at once. The clock expiring does not automatically launch bombs. It launches interpretation. And in geopolitics, interpretation can be just as dangerous as the first strike. Because once the world decides what the deadline meant, policy starts moving around that verdict. And Asian markets were already watching a Tuesday, 8 p.m. Eastern Time deadline tied to whether Iran would reach a deal and whether the strait would fully reopen. That means if the hour arrives and the waterway is still effectively crippled, investors do not wait for a history lesson. They read the message instantly. The crisis just beat the timeline that was supposed to control it. And once that happens, markets move before diplomats do. Tanker owners hesitate, insurers widen their assumptions, governments start gaming emergency responses, and importers start asking how much longer they can survive on promises instead of throughput. The terrifying part is that both escalation and hesitation can make that reaction worse. If Washington strikes, the fear is obvious. If Washington does not strike, the fear becomes something colder, the sense that Tehran has found a pressure point so expensive that even a public deadline could not break it. That is why the deadline is not just about what the United States might do to Iran. It is about what the United States tells the world about itself. If it does not, public threats only work if other actors believe the cost of ignoring them is higher than the cost of obeying them. Hormuz is where that theory gets stress tested against reality. If this disruption drags on, the consequences stop being a scary chart and become a supply crisis. A significant spike in oil prices becomes inevitable, and physical shortages start to develop if the chokehold lasts. That is when 8 p.m. stops being a news cycle marker and becomes the point where delay itself starts carrying strategic cost. Most coverage stays trapped in the language of volatility because volatility sounds manageable. It sounds like numbers moving, traders overreacting, analysts updating screens. Shortage is different. Shortage is when fear stops living in the market and starts living in the system. And once the system starts reacting, everybody gets dragged closer to the crisis than they expected. Fertilizer prices, shipping routes, fuel costs, power security, strategic reserves, domestic politics. The blast radius widens fast. That is why a waterway between Iran and Oman can turn into a problem for families nowhere near the Gulf. The United States has already felt this, where voters feel everything first. Regular gasoline climbed to about $3.50 per gallon, up roughly 56 cents, or 19% from late February. So when people say Hormuz is mostly an Asia problem, they are missing the point completely. Oil is global, fear is global, and Americans still pay. That makes the deadline politically radioactive inside the United States as well. It is one thing to issue a hard timestamp. It is another to watch that timestamp fail while consumers keep absorbing the cost. A delayed strike can be explained. A gas price spike tied to a failed ultimatum is much harder to explain away. And this is where the information war becomes critical. Tehran benefits from saying the strait is not closed, only controlled. Washington benefits from saying, reopen it now, which frames Iran as the disruptor and America as the enforcer of order. But the evidence sitting underneath both narratives says something more damaging to both sides. Neither one has restored normal passage. That means 8 p.m. ET is not a clean military trigger. It is a dirty definition battle. What exactly counts as reopened? Free passage for everyone? No attacks, no hidden restrictions, no fear pricing, no selective access. If those standards are not met, then the deadline has not solved the core problem, even if officials try to word their way out of it. That is why a prolonged breakdown here is described in such severe terms. It would create oil market conditions with no historical precedent. No historical precedent means no clean script, no painless off-ramp, and no guarantee that once confidence is broken, military action can rebuild it quickly. That is a much darker reality than the phrase "reopen the strait" suggests. Now we can answer the title with the brutality it actually deserves. If 8 p.m. arrives and Hormuz is still effectively shut, scenario 1 is escalation. Washington treats the deadline as a credibility line, decides Iran is still in defiance, and moves toward the infrastructure strikes it has been openly threatening. That would make the hour the bridge from shipping crisis to infrastructure war. Scenario 2 is the mass climb down. The White House declares progress, redefines selective movement as enough, and buys time under the cover of diplomacy. Markets might calm for a moment, but the strategic message would be devastating. Tehran proved it can keep the artery half strangled and survive an American ultimatum anyway. Scenario 3 is the slow poison. No dramatic strike, no real climb down, just a fog of statements, partial transits, and another round of threats hanging over a lane that is still nowhere near normal. That would tell the world something even more corrosive than a direct failure, that this crisis can remain unresolved long after the deadline that was supposed to resolve it. And here's the part most people miss. Those 3 scenarios are not equal in tone, but they all point to the same deeper conclusion. They all say Hormuz is no longer just an oil route. It is now a weaponized test site for deterrence, and the first actor to regain normality has not shown up yet. That brings us back to the man hiding in the mountains. He matters because he proves the crisis is already personal, already kinetic, already beyond abstraction, before the deadline even expires. One American has already had to survive alone behind enemy lines while special operations forces raced in to pull him out. That is not the prelude to a manageable standoff. That is what escalation already looks like before politicians decide whether to call it that. So if you want the cleanest possible answer, here it is. At 8 p.m. ET on April 7th, if Hormuz is still shut, the world does not simply wait for oil to move. It learns whether Washington is willing to make good on a threat that could widen the war, or whether Iran has found the one lever that can keep the global economy tense and while forcing the United States to choose between humiliation and escalation. If the threatened strikes come, 8 p.m. becomes the hour a maritime chokehold turned into an infrastructure war. If they do not come, 8 p.m. becomes the hour a public ultimatum met Hormuz and failed to force real surrender. Either way, one truth survives the noise. The deadline does not decide whether this crisis is dangerous. It decides who the world believes controls it. And that is the final conclusion you should leave with. The real event at 8 p.m. is not a post, not a speech, not even the first possible strike. It is the verdict on whether the United States can still turn a public threat into control over events at the most important energy choke point on Earth. Stay subscribed. We follow the moment the headline ends and the pressure starts deciding history.